to tell Erika that.
Yeah.
Erika is very shrewd. She's very smart. It was a great story. I can't really tell you who this was, but it was a very important person. And it happened within hours of the news. And the call goes in. She takes it because it was a very important person. And the question was to her, okay, so this is a starting point. Like, what do you know? And she was like, I know everything. And I was like, that's...
The moment Andrew Kolvet finally broke his silence, everything changed, and not in a subtle way. Because for months, the conversation around Erika Kirk had been floating in that uncomfortable grey zone, not fully confirmed, not completely dismissed. People were whispering, speculating, connecting dots quietly. But the second Andrew started talking, those whispers turned into something louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. Because this wasn't just some random outsider speaking, this was someone who had been inside the same circle, close enough to see things most people never would. And what made it even more unsettling wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. Calm, measured, almost too familiar. Like someone describing a story they had been sitting on for a long time. And suddenly, the timeline everyone thought they understood started to feel unstable. Because if Andrew had known Erika from the very beginning, back when she first entered Turning Point USA, then this wasn't just about what happened after Charlie Kirk. This raised a much bigger, much more uncomfortable question. How much of this story actually started before anyone was paying attention? Because once people started replaying old clips, resurfacing past moments, and comparing versions of events, something didn't line up the way it was supposed to. And the internet noticed. Fast. What looked like coincidence started feeling like a pattern. What sounded like support started sounding personal. And what was once dismissed as just rumors suddenly had a voice attached to it. A voice with credibility, access, and just enough detail to make people stop scrolling and start paying attention. And now the situation isn't just about one claim or one moment anymore. It's about a timeline that doesn't sit right. A connection that feels deeper than it's being presented. And a question that keeps getting louder the more you look at it. Was this really something that began after everything happened? Or was it already there, hidden in plain sight the entire time? The deeper you go into this story, the more it starts to feel like two completely different versions of reality are running at the same time, and the gap between them is where all the tension lives. On one side, you have the clean, public narrative, a grieving widow, a trusted colleague, and a tragic event that pulled people together. Simple, understandable, easy to accept. But on the other side, you have a growing list of details that don't quite sit right when you line them up next to each other. And that's where things start to shift, because once people begin noticing inconsistencies, they don't stop, they start digging. What makes this situation different from typical internet speculation is that it didn't start with random guesses. It started with familiarity. Andrew Kolvet wasn't just commenting from the outside, he was describing someone he had known for years. He didn't talk about Erika like a distant public figure, he talked about her like someone whose personality, habits, and mindset he understood deeply. And that tone matters, because when someone speaks with that level of confidence, people naturally start asking how far back that connection really goes. Not just when it became visible, but when it actually started. And this is where the timeline becomes the center of everything. Because timelines don't lie, but they do expose gaps. According to the public version, the closeness between Andrew and Erika developed after everything happened. Two people navigating the same emotional shock, leaning on each other, finding comfort in a situation that no one is prepared for. That explanation works on the surface. But when you start placing older footage, past interactions, and witness accounts next to that timeline, it begins to stretch in ways that don't quite hold. People noticed that Andrew wasn't just around, he was consistently present. Not loudly, not in a way that grabbed headlines, but in a steady, almost strategic way. The kind of presence that doesn't raise alarms at first because it blends into the background. And that's exactly why it stands out now. Because when others were reportedly being distanced or removed from the inner circle after Charlie's passing, Andrew remained. Not only remained, but expanded his role. And that's not something people ignore, especially in a situation where others were quietly disappearing. So now the question becomes less about coincidence and more about positioning. Because in any organization, especially one as structured and visible as Turning Point USA, proximity matters. Access matters. And who stays close during moments of transition matters more than anything else. If people were being filtered out, whether quietly or directly, then the ones who stayed weren't random, they were chosen, protected, or already aligned with what was coming next. And that's the part that makes people pause. Then there's the tone shift, the way Andrew speaks about Erika now compared to how most people would describe someone in that position. It's not just respectful, it's detailed, almost analytical, highlighting traits like intelligence, awareness, control. Words that suggest he sees her not just as a person, but as someone operating with intention. And when you combine that with his comment about her saying, "I know everything" early on, it creates a moment that people can't ignore. Because that statement alone carries weight. It suggests awareness, preparedness, maybe even anticipation, and that's not something people expect in a situation that was supposed to be sudden and chaotic. And then you have the visual layer, the part that doesn't rely on statements or claims, just observation. Body language, timing, interactions caught on camera. Moments that, individually, might not mean much, but together start forming a pattern. The kind of comfort, ease, and familiarity that people associate with an existing connection, not a newly formed one. And once viewers start noticing that, it changes how every interaction is interpreted. What once looked like support now looks like something closer. What once felt natural now feels rehearsed. But the most sensitive part of all this is how it reflects back on Charlie himself. Because in every version of this story, he becomes the center of a question he can't answer. The way he spoke about Erika, his trust, his admiration, the image he believed in, it paints a picture of someone who saw her in a very specific light. A light that, according to some people online, doesn't fully match what's being uncovered now. And that contrast is what hits hardest. Because it's not just about what might have happened, it's about whether he ever had the full picture. That's why the conversation isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. Because once doubt enters a narrative, it spreads quickly, especially when new pieces keep surfacing. And right now, this isn't a closed story, it's an evolving one. Every new clip, every resurfaced detail, every statement adds another layer. And instead of clarifying things, those layers are making the situation feel more complex, not less. At this point, it's no longer about proving one version right or wrong, it's about understanding why there are two versions at all. Why the public story feels so clean, while the underlying details feel so messy. And more importantly, why the gap between those two keeps getting wider instead of closing. Because usually, when something is simple, it stays simple. But when something keeps expanding the more you look at it, that's when people start asking the question no one can ignore anymore: what are we still not seeing? By the time the timeline starts bending, people don't just look at what was said, they start looking at what was done. And this is where the story shifts from speculation into something more uncomfortable, because behavior leaves patterns in a way words never can. You can explain statements, you can spin narratives, but consistent behavior, especially under pressure, reveals alignment. And when people began revisiting the sequence of events surrounding Charlie Kirk's final moments and the immediate aftermath, what stood out wasn't chaos, it was coordination. Because think about it. In situations that are truly sudden and unstructured, the first few hours are messy. Information is scattered, reactions are raw, people don't have clear roles yet. But what some observers pointed out here was something different: movements that seemed too smooth, responses that felt too prepared, and individuals who appeared to already know where they needed to be. And right at the center of those observations, the same two names kept coming up: Erika Kirk and Andrew Kolvet. Now, none of this proves anything on its own, and that's important to say clearly. But patterns don't need to prove something immediately to raise questions. They just need to repeat. And once people started mapping movements, who was where, who spoke first, who appeared alongside whom, the sequence didn't feel as spontaneous as it was originally presented. It felt structured. Almost like pieces were already in motion before the public even knew what had happened. One of the most discussed moments is that early contact, Andrew describing a call happening within hours. A conversation where Erika reportedly responded with, "I know everything." That line has stuck with people more than anything else, not because it confirms something, but because of what it implies. In a moment where information should be incomplete, fragmented, still forming, how does someone confidently say they already understand everything? Is it composure? Is it shock? Or is it prior awareness? That's the kind of ambiguity that doesn't fade, it grows. And then there's the travel timeline, which is where things get even more complicated. Online discussions have focused heavily on movement, flight paths, arrival windows, who was physically where at specific times. Again, none of this is officially confirmed in a way that closes the case, but when multiple data points start overlapping, people don't ignore it. They start connecting it. The suggestion that Andrew may have been moving toward Scottsdale before full public confirmation raises a critical question, not whether it's true, but why it even appears possible. Because if someone is already in motion before information becomes public, it changes how people interpret everything that follows. At the same time, attention turned to Erika's own timeline, where she was, when she was there, and how that aligns with the official narrative. And this is where the idea of an alibi started circulating online. The attempt to support her location with a photo, something that should have clarified things, instead created more confusion. Because the image itself didn't definitively prove what it was meant to. It didn't clearly establish time, place, or presence in a way that would close the conversation. And when something meant to simplify a situation ends up complicating it, people don't move on, they lean in. That's when the tone of the discussion shifted from curiosity to skepticism. Because now it wasn't just about what might have happened, it was about whether the narrative being presented was complete. And once the doubt sets in, every detail starts being re-evaluated. The tarmac moment, for example, a scene framed as pure grief, raw emotion, spontaneous connection. But when people began aligning timestamps and sequences, even that moment came under scrutiny. Not because it looked fake, but because it looked timed. And timing, in situations like this, is everything. But what really fuels this entire situation isn't just the events, it's the contrast. The difference between how things look on the surface and how they feel when you examine them closely. Publicly, everything aligns with a story of loss, transition, and resilience. But underneath, there's a current of something more controlled, more deliberate, more calculated. And that contrast is what keeps people engaged, because humans are wired to notice when something doesn't fully match. Then there's the organizational angle, the internal shifts within Turning Point USA after Charlie's passing. Reports of staff being quietly removed, insiders being distanced, voices disappearing without explanation. In any organization, that kind of restructuring raises questions. But in a moment like this, it amplifies them. Because when people are being filtered out, the ones who remain become even more significant. And once again, Andrew's continued presence, and growth in visibility, stands out. That leads to a deeper question about influence. Not just who was present, but who had a voice, who had access, and who had the ability to shape the narrative moving forward. Because in moments of transition, the individuals closest to the center often determine what the next version of that story looks like. And if Andrew was already positioned near that center, then his role wasn't just passive, it was potentially influential. But the most powerful element in all of this is still perception. Because regardless of what's proven or unproven, the way people interpret a situation can shape its impact just as much as the facts themselves. Right now, perception is shifting. The idea that everything happened exactly as presented is no longer universally accepted. Instead, people are holding two possibilities at once, and that tension is what keeps the story alive. And maybe that's the real turning point here. Not a single revelation, not a definitive answer, but the moment when the audience stops passively consuming a story and starts actively questioning it. Because once that happens, the narrative doesn't belong to one source anymore. It becomes something bigger, something more complex, something that evolves with every new detail that surfaces. And right now, that evolution is still happening. The timeline isn't settled. The connections aren't fully explained. And the biggest question, the one sitting quietly underneath everything, still hasn't been answered. Not who said what. Not who was where. But something deeper, something harder to ignore. If this really was just a sequence of unfortunate events, then why does it feel like pieces of it were already in place before anyone realized what was happening? At this stage, the story stops being about individual moments and starts becoming about intent. Because once enough details begin to overlap, timelines, behavior, positioning, the conversation naturally shifts from what happened to why did it happen this way. And that's a much harder question to ignore. Because intent doesn't live in a single action, it lives in patterns. And when people start seeing those patterns repeat, especially around the same individuals, it changes how everything is interpreted moving forward. What makes this situation especially intense is that it sits right at the intersection of perception and trust. Public figures rely on perception to maintain credibility, but once that perception starts cracking, trust follows quickly behind it. And right now, that's exactly what's happening with how people are viewing Erika Kirk. Because the image that was once presented, controlled, composed, grounded, now exists alongside a completely different interpretation being built in real time by the audience. And when those two versions don't align, people don't just pick one, they analyze both. The same applies to Andrew Kolvet. Because his role in all of this has evolved from background presence to central figure in the conversation. Not because he made a dramatic announcement or dropped a definitive claim, but because of how consistently his name appears when people start connecting dots. And in situations like this, repetition matters. The more often a name surfaces in key moments, the harder it becomes to separate coincidence from involvement. But here's where it gets even more layered, because this isn't just about external observations anymore. It's about internal dynamics. What was happening inside the environment these people shared? What conversations were taking place that the public never heard? What relationships existed in a way that didn't need to be explained at the time because no one was looking closely enough? Those are the questions that don't have direct answers, but they create a framework that shapes how every new piece of information is received. And then there's the emotional layer, the one that's harder to measure but impossible to ignore. Because grief, shock, and loss usually follow certain patterns. They are messy, inconsistent, often unpredictable. But what some observers have pointed out here is a level of composure that feels different. Not necessarily wrong, but not typical either. And when people sense that difference, they don't immediately reject it, but they do question it. Because emotional responses are one of the few things people instinctively recognize when something feels off. That's why the smallest details start carrying more weight. A tone of voice. A moment of eye contact. The timing of a statement. None of these things prove anything individually, but together, they build a narrative that feels either authentic or constructed. And right now, the audience is split between those two interpretations. Some see strength and control. Others see calculation and preparation. And that divide is what keeps the conversation alive, because both sides are looking at the same moments, but seeing completely different meanings. Meanwhile, the broader context continues to add pressure. Because this isn't happening in isolation, it's happening within a highly visible organization, a politically charged environment, and a public space where every move is scrutinized. And when something unfolds under that level of attention, even small inconsistencies become amplified. Not because they are necessarily significant, but because they exist in a space where everything is being analyzed in real time. That's also why the idea of narrative control keeps coming up. Who is shaping the story? Who is deciding which details are emphasized and which are minimized? Because in any situation like this, the first version of events that reaches the public often becomes the foundation for everything that follows. But if that foundation starts to show cracks, then every new piece of information has the potential to reshape it. And right now, that reshaping is happening continuously. Then there's the question of silence, what hasn't been said. Because in high-profile situations, silence can be just as powerful as statements. The absence of clarification, the lack of direct responses, the decision to not address certain claims, all of these choices contribute to how the story evolves. And when silence persists while questions grow, people don't interpret that as neutrality, they interpret it as avoidance, whether that's fair or not. And this is where the story reaches its most critical point, not because of a single revelation, but because of accumulated uncertainty. The kind that doesn't explode all at once, but builds slowly, layer by layer, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Because at some point, the audience stops asking for confirmation and starts forming conclusions based on patterns alone. And once that happens, the narrative becomes harder to control than it was at the beginning. But maybe the most important shift isn't happening in the details, it's happening in the mindset of the people watching. Because this is no longer a passive audience. This is an audience that's actively comparing, analyzing, questioning. And once people reach that level of engagement, they don't go back to simply accepting what they are told. They start looking for alignment. They start testing consistency. And when something doesn't match, they hold onto that disconnect. And right now, there are too many disconnects for this story to feel settled. Too many moments that raise questions instead of answering them. Too many overlapping details that suggest something more complex than the version being presented. And that doesn't automatically mean there's a hidden truth, but it does mean the current explanation isn't fully satisfying the people paying attention. Which brings everything back to the core tension of this entire situation, not what has been said, not what has been shown, but what still doesn't fit. Because when a story keeps expanding the more you examine it, it usually means one of two things. Either the situation is more complicated than it appears, or the full picture hasn't been revealed yet. And right now, based on everything people are seeing, hearing, and connecting, the possibility that there's still more beneath the surface doesn't feel unlikely anymore. It feels expected. By now, this story isn't just being watched, it's being felt. Because once a narrative reaches this level of complexity, it stops living in facts alone and starts living in perception, emotion, and instinct. And right now, the instinct most people are having is simple: something about this doesn't sit right. Not because of one detail, not because of one statement, but because of how everything fits together when you step back and look at the full picture. And this is where the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. Because when a story reaches this point, it demands resolution, but instead of getting clearer, it's getting heavier. Every new detail doesn't simplify things, it adds weight. And that weight is sitting directly on the connection between Erika Kirk and Andrew Kolvet. Not because anything has been definitively proven, but because the pattern of proximity, timing, and familiarity keeps repeating in a way that people can't easily dismiss anymore. And here's the uncomfortable truth: patterns don't need confirmation to influence belief. They just need consistency. And when people start seeing the same two names appear across multiple layers of a situation, before, during, and after, it naturally creates a narrative in their minds. A narrative that may or may not be accurate, but becomes powerful simply because it feels coherent. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. But the real turning point isn't just about them, it's about how this reflects back on Charlie Kirk himself. Because in every version of this story, whether you believe the public narrative or the alternative interpretations, he becomes the center of something he never got to explain. And that's what makes this situation emotionally charged. Because people aren't just analyzing events, they are asking whether he understood the reality around him while he was still in it. That question changes everything. Because it introduces a level of vulnerability that people connect with instantly. The idea that someone could be fully invested in a version of truth that wasn't complete, that's something audiences don't just observe, they react to it. And once that emotional connection is made, the story stops being distant. It becomes personal. At the same time, the environment around all of this continues to feel controlled, but not in a way that reassures people. Instead, it creates more distance. Statements feel measured. Responses feel limited. And the absence of direct clarity leaves space for interpretation. And when that space exists, people fill it. Not randomly, but based on the patterns they've already noticed. That's why even the smallest moments are being re-examined. Old clips, past interviews, interactions that once seemed ordinary, they are all being looked at through a completely different lens now. And once a lens changes, everything it focuses on changes too. What once felt like coincidence now feels intentional. What once seemed harmless now feels significant. And once that shift happens, it's almost impossible to reverse. Then there's the idea of timing, the one element that quietly connects everything. Because timing doesn't just tell you when something happened, it tells you how it happened. And when people start noticing that key moments align just a little too neatly, it raises a different kind of question. Not is this true, but why does this feel structured? And that's a much harder question to answer, because it doesn't rely on facts alone, it relies on perception. And perception, once it shifts, becomes the most powerful force in any story. Because it doesn't need proof to influence belief, it just needs alignment. And right now, for a growing number of people watching this unfold, the alignment they are seeing isn't matching the version they were first given. So now the situation exists in two spaces at once. The official narrative, clean, contained, straightforward. And the interpreted narrative, layered, complex, unresolved. And the longer both of these versions exist side by side without fully reconciling, the stronger the tension becomes. Because people don't like unresolved contradictions. They want clarity. They want closure. And when they don't get it, they keep searching. And that search is exactly what's driving this story forward. Not a single revelation. Not a single piece of evidence. But the accumulation of questions that haven't been answered in a way that feels complete. Which brings us to the point where everything hangs in balance. Because at some point, one of two things has to happen. Either the narrative stabilizes, through clarity, explanation, alignment, or it continues to fragment, with more details adding more pressure instead of relieving it. And right now, based on everything that's unfolding, it doesn't feel like it's stabilizing. It feels like it's building. And when a story keeps building without resolution, it usually means one thing: the most important piece hasn't surfaced yet. Because if everything we've seen so far already feels this layered, this complex, this difficult to fully explain, then the real question isn't what we know. It's what we are still missing. And this is where everything comes full circle, but not in the way most people expect. Because after everything we've walked through, the timelines, the behavior, the patterns, the unanswered questions, you don't actually end up with a clean conclusion. You end up with something much more powerful, a realization. A realization that sometimes, the most important part of a story isn't what's confirmed, It's what refuses to fully make sense. And that's exactly where this situation still stands. Because no matter which side someone leans toward, no matter what version feels more believable, one thing remains constant: there are still gaps. And those gaps are what keep pulling people back into this conversation over and over again. Because if everything was truly as simple as it was first presented, the questions would have stopped by now. The timeline would feel settled. The connections would feel clear. The narrative would feel complete. But that's not what's happening. Instead, the deeper people look, the more layered it becomes. And that doesn't automatically mean something is hidden, but it does mean something hasn't fully aligned yet. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Not a final answer. Not a definitive conclusion. But the understanding that this story is still unfolding in real time, and the version we have right now might not be the final one. Because stories like this don't resolve quickly. They evolve. They shift. And sometimes, the truth, whatever that truth may be, only becomes clear when all the pieces finally fall into place. Now I want to hear from you, because this isn't one of those stories where there's only one way to read it. Everyone watching this is picking up on something different. Some of you are focused on the timeline. Some of you are looking at behavior. Others are paying attention to what hasn't been said at all. And that's exactly why this conversation matters. So don't just watch this and scroll past, drop your honest thoughts in the comments. Not what you think people want to hear, what you actually see when you look at everything laid out. Do you think this is all coincidence that got blown out of proportion? Or do you think there are still pieces missing that haven't come to light yet? And if you've made it this far, you already know this isn't surface level content. So make sure you hit that like button. It tells the algorithm you want more breakdowns like this. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we are not stopping here. As more details come out, we are going to keep tracking this story step by step, connecting everything in a way most channels won't. And one more thing, share this video with someone who's been following this situation. Because the more perspectives we bring into this, the clearer the bigger picture becomes. This story isn't over yet. Not even close. And the next update might change everything.